What's up, gunfighters? This is installment 2. The first one we talked about 80s action movies, the assault weapons ban, shootouts, up until September 11th. September 11th is where we're going to pick this up today. I don't know if you heard, but September 11th was kind of a big deal in America. With that, I hope you enjoy this section 2. If you haven't, go back and listen to section 1. An event that would affect all of us, especially myself, because I had already joined the Marine Corps at the time. September 11th, 2001. I had already joined the Marine Corps, and I remember when I saw that, I just knew we were going to war. Now, it's worth reflecting on this, that we just gave up a 20-year war. 20 years of war. But prior to this, I don't want to take away from the people that lost their lives in small conflicts like Panama, Grenada in the 80s. But really, we had not seen a large-scale mobilization of the U.S. military, Army, Marine Corps, since Vietnam, which was in the 60s, early 70s. It was a long lull in massive, large-scale conflict. But September 11th, that changed. We were reminded that, Muslims hating us and wanting to kill us, and by us I mean Christians, or broadly the Western world, Muslims wanted to kill us. They have since the 600s. That's unfair, maybe the 800s. Since they started getting power, they started killing us. It's like the Crusades, which were righteous and righteously fought, that they took over land not belonging to them and we kicked them out and reclaimed it for a while. We were reminded there were a group of people out there, Muslims, that wanted to kill you. They hated you. We were reminded of that and we went to war. It's not a small war. This is the longest war that I'm aware of in American history. Most of our wars lasted 5 years or less. A decade or less. 20 years. A 20-year war. So because it's 20 years, there were a lot of incremental steps in this. Come back to gear later, but when I started, I was issued an M16A2 iron sights, 20-inch barrel, metal magazines, black polished boots, the old woodland camouflage pattern uniform, a web sling, like a parade-style World War II era sling. To give you an idea of what we were working with, because again, we hadn't been in conflict in a while. I was also issued a Beretta 92. I was infantry. Most infantry is not issued a handgun. I was specialized infantry, and MOS that does not exist anymore, but an assaultman. I was infantry that also worked with demolitions. Now, this again was 2001. I was in prior to 9/11, but many Americans. This was like the rah-rah, let's all rally together, America is great, let's go fight the Mohammedans. Toby Keith and his Put a Boot in You, America country music. Everybody was supporting the troops. We had no idea it was going to be a long war. Quick aside, when I went to war, we fought. I was there for the initial invasion. We fought all the way from the Kuwaiti border to Baghdad. We took Baghdad. We were stuck in Iraq for a while. I figured just it took a while to cycle everybody home. It was a massive invasion. We got back. We were all celebrating. We thought the war was over. We took the capital. Historically, when you take the capital, sack the capital, liberate the capital, however you want to put it, the war is over. When we get home, we're all celebrating like we just won a war. I mean, the Gulf War, I'm not taking away from the Gulf War, but it lasted 100 hours. Already been there almost a year. Compared to the Gulf War, it was already a long war. Again, 100 hours. We thought the war was over. We got a speech, go home, go see your families, enjoy it, and then come back and get ready. You're going back. Like, going back for what? The war's over. It's not even close to being over. We had no idea. But again, 2001, the initial invasion. And what? Now, I was not watching TV at the time. Internet existed. Internet was not a big thing. This will become important later. But internet's not really a thing. I obviously was not watching TV when I was overseas, watching American news. We didn't have showers. We had very rudimentary satellite phones. This was still in the era where you wrote letters if you wanted to get a hold of somebody. And that was one of the great things about the war, is getting to write people and have them write me back. I'm waiting for mail. Obviously, you didn't always get mail if your convoys were being bombed or you were Oscar Mike on the move, but when you stopped for a while, you might actually get some mail. And that was a bright spot in a very dark place. This was pre-internet. I was not watching the news, but I can imagine the rest of America was very supportive of the war, at least for quite a few years into it. And you saw a lot of footage. Much like Vietnam, this was a televised war. You got to see Americans fighting. You got to see what they were fighting with, germane to today American gun culture. I covered this small section, this small sliver of modern American gun culture in other episodes, in the GWOT, the Global War on Terror, and how it shaped American gun culture and all the innovation. So I'm not going to get super deep into it because I got more deep into it previously. But Americans saw this, and they saw the gear that we were using. And again, this is a very patriotic, it's the most pro-America, everybody comes together time in my lifetime, in many Americans' lifetime, even older than me. America, in my opinion, started going down the crapper in 1964. This was a small blip of when we were all pulling together again. But Americans were seeing, and Americans that were into guns were seeing the guns being used by us. Sadly, most of those were malum prohibitum, thanks again to the year that will live in infamy, the 1994 assault weapons ban. But there was a sunset in 2004. In 2004, the party was back on. Americans could actually have normal firearms again. This was a big deal. Also, we already talked about it, but the Cold War had collapsed. There was a giant amount of surplus, and now A.K.s were back on the menu. And this is the golden era of A.K.s, in my opinion. It started to be the golden era. It would continue for a while. The drunken A.K. fest would last for quite a while. A.K. is a good weapon. I actually had a catastrophic failure of my M16 during the war, and I for a time used an A.K. A.K. is a good weapon. You started seeing mass affordable A.K.s on the American market. Again, there were some before this, but you really started seeing like really good affordable A.K.s on the market. Polish. They're some of the best in my opinion, but there were other very good ones and crazy cheap ones. This is why Americans falsely get the idea that A.K.s are cheap, because you were buying them at a loss for the people that made them. Like they had the Soviet Union collapsed. A lot of these satellite states were very poor, and they didn't have a lot. But one thing they had was a stockpile of Soviet arms, and they weren't part of the Soviet Union anymore, so they sold them for a song and a dance. You saw Americans getting really, really good A.K.s for a couple $100. Again, this was the golden era of it. Also, even in the American military at this point, 2004, there have been optics used in the military on some weapon systems, but for the primary infantrymen, we weren't running optics yet. So the A.K. wasn't really far behind, and the ammunition was super affordable as well. And this, because of the assault weapons ban, there wasn't a lot of innovation in those 10 years in the AR on the civilian side. Again, they were very expensive, not like today where it's the reverse. If you're looking at getting an AR, you were probably still looking at like $1,000 Colt. And we're talking early 2000s money. Pre-COVID-flation money. Like, that was good money. You could get an S.K.s for $120, $130. An A.K. for a couple of $100. So the market was way different than it is today. You might be able to get a Bushmaster a little bit cheaper. Maybe Olympic arms if you were into competition shooting, but that was really it. The A.K., or as I was, the AR market was not what it is today. You started seeing people wanting them, I think. This demand was created by the GWOT. You started seeing M16s at that time. M4s were pretty rare. It was mostly the M16. You started seeing them used and used effectively. And again, America was kind of behind the war as opposed to Vietnam. So you started building this demand for the AR, and then the floodgates opened for the average American when the assault weapons ban sunsetted. The average American really wanted an AR. And you started seeing these companies pop up. Tons of companies started to creep out. So many now I can't even keep track. But there was way more options than just Colt. And Colt has always made a good AR. They've always been fairly spendy. you started seeing all kinds of companies pop up for ARs. And you started seeing, based on the global war on terror, innovations in tactical equipment. Again, this can't really be overstated how far we've come. I went from black polished boots and woodland camo, a web sling. Like, to give you an idea, if we wanted a tactical sling, we were making them, myself included. We made them with zip ties and 2 parade slings where we'd put one up and down the rifle and one kind of in a loop to make a 3-point sling with 2 old World War II web slings. I remember when Blackhawk, they were the tactical du jour back in the day. When Blackhawk came out with a 3-point sling, which by today's standards is pretty atrocious, but back then it was a game changer. We were buying them with our own money. We were getting body armor. Before that, it was a flak jacket. Legit body armor with SAPI plates. Common for civilians to have that today. It wasn't even common for infantrymen to have that long before that. Think about that. The amount of innovation. Started to see Molly. Before that, it was the old World War II or maybe Vietnam era clips, like metal clips. Started seeing this modularity in packs, in web gear, in the Molly system. And to be fair, the first Molly packs were atrocious. The second generation was better. But you started seeing all this tactical equipment coming out. Drop leg holsters became popular. Why? Because our body armor at the time was so big and bulky and heavy, you couldn't really carry a sidearm on your belt. Drop leg holster was a decent option at the time. It's not today. Don't get a drop leg holster unless you're trying to do some, I don't know, LARPing of the 90s or the 2000s. But at least it was a tactical holster. We were running them in Bianchi UM84s. A World War II era flap holster. That's what we had. So the amount of innovation coming out of the GWAT, this was a massive offensive on 2 fronts, Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was a lot of R&D from the military-industrial complex going into this stuff, and that trickled down into the civilian market. It also started being used in police. Now, the militarization of police had been going on for a long time, but I think a lot of this affordable, and I remember a few years later when I got into police work, my first deployment, M16A2s. My second deployment, M16A4s with an ACOG. Later, a lot of people will get ACOGs. I was one of the very first people to get an ACOG, aside from some like R&D stuff. As an expert rifleman in the Marine Corps, I got ACOGs before everybody had ACOGs. This was kind of a game changer, a rugged, affordable optic that would stand up to hard infantry use, and M16A4s with a flat top upper. Before this, it was iron sights. We were shooting iron sights out to 500 yards. This optic was a big deal. Kicking down doors, doing urban warfare at night with iron sights, and tactical flashlight of the day was a mini mag light. Started seeing affordable, decent optics, affordable, decent flashlights, white lights. That, talk about a game changer. You know, we did urban warfare with mini mag lights and iron sights kicking down doors. Yeah, that was a thing. I must add, the mini mag light was like the upgraded thing that you bought on your own because you didn't want to die. We issued the big curved 90-degree angle moonbeams. Forget if they were C or D batteries, but those things were atrocious. Very shortly, we had Surefires. We had Trigicon ACOGs, Advanced Combat Optical Gun Sights. And a lot of the older gear got sent to police departments. Because a few years later, I would become a police officer and I would get some of this gear. It was like federal equipment on loan to or given to police agencies because there was a giant surplus. Army was going to M4s, Marine Corps was going to M16A4s. A lot of those older things were given to law enforcement. And a lot of the tactical gear was going to law enforcement. So we started seeing a militarization of the police force, which I'm not going to get into. That's a political thing, but we started to see it, I think. It was happening before this, but I think the innovation in equipment and the massive surplus, not available to American civilians, but available to American law enforcement and cheap, let's say, patrol rifle concept really became a thing. It was available before this, but really became common in American police work, the patrol rifle. And as far as television goes, obviously the global war on terror and movies being made about it are showing this kind of gear as well, so it became super popular. Throughout this whole era, the Glock was picking up steam. It was affordable, it was cheap. It started the entire craze of, and this obviously happened in about the same time, but in a different realm. but the polymer striker-fired handgun craze. Glock showed, it wasn't the first, I know it wasn't the first, but it was the first that really showed that Plastic Fantastics tactical Tupperware polymer striker-fired handguns worked. I'm not going to say they're good because I don't think they are, but they worked. At first, you started seeing people try to copy them, like the Smith & Wesson Sigma, which made a Glock look good, which is hard to do. But pretty soon after that, you'd see other companies, and you'd start to see an explosion in the polymer striker-fired handgun market that we still see today, where the vast, vast majority of guns are polymer striker-fired handguns. Not because they're good, but because they're cheap and they work. Way cheaper, in most cases, to make a chunk of plastic firing pin with a spring wrapped around it. Something much more, I would say, elegant and complicated, like a Beretta 92 or a 1911 for that matter. And with the, again, a lot of these things tie together, with the assault weapons ban, the average civilian could get a decent, normal capacity handgun. This was the late 90s, early 2000s. 40 was still in full swing at this point. A few years before, and I still, in the 2000s, would see some cops with wheel guns. In this era, if you were looking at a cop, he was probably carrying a Glock or a Smith & Wesson semi-auto, maybe an HK, and 40 Smith & Wesson. Again, some carry Beretta 92s, but the average cop was going to be carrying a 40 semi-auto of some kind in the late 90s and into the 2000s. And those advancements in lights also greatly helped law enforcement. From the old mag lights, the giant mag lights, doubled as a baton, literally doubled as a baton, to small, handheld, xenon, later L.E.D, powerful, effective, small lights. And the optics continued to trudge along throughout all this. Now, somewhere around, a lot of these people joined up after September 11th. I got out in 2006 and went into law enforcement, but many of these guys started to get out around 2007. Your first enlistment guys, the guys that went and fought their standard 4-year enlistment, combat veterans, military veterans were getting out around 2007. And a lot of these young men who maybe otherwise wouldn't have been were introduced to firearms. Again, we had been at peace for a long, long time. Or if we weren't at peace, we weren't at war for decades. But now a big chunk of a generation had been to war and had used firearms and was acquainted with firearms. A lot of these guys got out and wanted to continue to use firearms. And they got what was on the market. A lot of them got the cheap surplus stuff. A lot of them wanted M16, AR-15 type rifles that they used in the service. And a lot of them would return or get into hunting. Hunting was a bit different, let's say the 2007 era. Now, there had always been new cartridges, new products introduced for hunting every year. This is nothing new. But perhaps something to do with the veterans coming back and hunting, and perhaps not. Perhaps it's just a different thing altogether. But starting in the mid-2000s, we started to see, in my opinion, and maybe I just don't remember before this, I was poor when I grew up hunting in the South after I got out of the war, and I was a man making man money in L.A.P.D., like a disposable income. Maybe I was just more aware of it. That's fair. But in the mid to late 2000s, I'd say more later to 2000s, we started seeing a massive dump of new cartridges all the time in the hunting rifle world. It was short magnum craze. The 6.5 Creedmoor was introduced in 2007. Started to see a bunch of these short magnums, 300 Wism, 270 Wism, 7 Wism, a lot of the forgotten ones, 25 Super Wism, 223 super short magnums, to mention the Ruger Compact Magnums, the Remington Ultra Magnums, just a glut of new cartridges, most of which died. But I talked about the optics catching on. This will be a major turning point. Good, affordable optics being used in the military, showing that they could be rugged and reliable, and now they were starting to become affordable. Leupold had been around a while, but Leupold, Nikon Pro Staffs were big then. These were rugged, affordable optics to be mounted on hunting rifles. Maybe there were more people wanting to hunt because a lot of these veterans who may have never picked up a rifle in their life now were acquainted with rifles and they liked shooting, and they were thought, how can I use this or do this so when I get out, maybe I'll put meat on the table. I think this was also a thing after World War II. A lot of these men came back from the war and wanted to hunt. Maybe that's just unique to me and most people that didn't affect. That's fair. Something else also happened around this time. One of the other things I see as a scourge on American gun culture itself, but what it's done to, I think, hunting. But that's the laser rangefinder. Now, these have been around a while, but really in the late 2000s they started to become affordable. I fell into this trap for a while. Started seeing affordable, decently rugged scopes and the affordability of a rangefinder. And the 6.5 Creedmoor. Not the only one. It was, I think, fairly. N.R.A cartridge did the same thing before, but the first popular next generation cartridge of long, sleek, high BC bullets. It's not a fast cartridge. It's not even as fast as the one it replaced, a 260 Remington, but it's predictable. And if you have a affordable laser rangefinder, they're way more affordable today than they were in the 2000s. You had decently portable, decently rugged rangefinders. So it didn't really matter how much the cartridge dropped. Before, again, earlier if you wanted to shoot long distance, it was high velocity, 270, 300 Win Mag. After this, you just needed a predictable cartridge that would buck the wind well. Because you knew the distance. Before, you didn't know, and it's very hard to judge range. But if you knew that target wasn't 600 yards away, it was 585 yards. It didn't really matter how flat the cartridge shot. And all these things came together and started this whole long-range shooting craze that we see today. Again, it wasn't all at once, but it's been a slow burn, and it's still in swing today. Now, I think this is where I'm going to call it for this installment. I stopped just shy of the 2008 housing market collapse to talk about the rise of modern prepping culture up into modern times. That's the next installment. Hope you enjoyed this. If you want the entire thing in one big chunk, early and ad-free, consider becoming a patron. If not, at least I hope you are subscribe so you get these when they come out. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.